Martin Scholes was not a remarkable man. He would have been the first one to tell you that. He worked at a shipping warehouse for 34 years. Same cracked boots every morning, same dented lunchbox, same 15-minute drive down the same road. He never won anything. Never stood out in any room. Never gave anyone a reason to look twice. He was the kind of man who moved through the world quietly, doing his job, paying his bills, going home tired. But on a cold Tuesday in November, in a small hospital chapel that smelled like old wood and candle wax, Martin Scholes sat down at a piano he had never touched in his life, and he tried to do something that had no right to work, something that made no practical sense, something that a man his age, with his hands, in his condition, had absolutely no business attempting. He tried to learn the hardest song his daughter had ever played, not because someone pushed him to, not because he had anything to prove to the world, but because he had spent 28 years being a father, and only now, with 7 days left, did he understand what that word was actually supposed to mean? The doctor didn't sit down when he walked in. Martin noticed that straight away. In his 3 weeks at the hospital, he had learned to read that small detail the way sailors read the sky. Doctors sit down when the news is something you can carry. They stay standing when it isn't. Dr. Harmon stood near the foot of the bed with his clipboard held in both hands and his face doing that careful, practiced thing that doctors practice so the patient doesn't see how bad it really is. Martin saw... Anyway, Martin, the cancer has progressed faster than we hoped. At these days, we're looking at approximately 7 days. Possibly less. I'm deeply sorry. 7 days. Martin didn't cry. He didn't raise his voice or demand a second opinion or ask why. He just turned his head toward the window and looked at the gray November sky for a long, still moment, the way a man looks at something when he's trying to memorize it. Then he nodded, slow and quiet. The nod of a man who had suspected this for a while and had just been waiting for someone to say it out loud. He asked only one question. Does my daughter know yet? The doctor shook his head. They had waited for Martin to decide how to handle it. Martin stared at the window a little longer. The sky outside was the color of old dishwater. A single bird crossed it and disappeared. Give me tonight, he sighed softly. I need to think. Clara arrived the next morning carrying 2 coffees she wasn't going to drink, and a smile she was working very hard to keep in place. She was 28 years old. Dark hair, pulled back, her mother's eyes, warm and a little sad, even when she was happy. She had her father's hands, though, wide palms. Short fingers, though she had done far more beautiful things with hers than Martin ever had. She sat down in the chair beside his bed and took one of his hands in both of hers and didn't say anything for a while. Just sat there, holding on, the way you hold on when you already know and you're just not ready to say it yet. Then, without realizing it, she started to hum. It was soft, barely there, the kind of humming that escapes a person when they're trying to hold everything else in. A quiet melody that floated up in that pale hospital room like something fragile and old. Martin turned his head toward her slowly. What is that song? Clara looked up at him. For just a second, something crossed her face. Surprise, maybe, or something older than surprise. Then she almost smiled. Dad, it's Clair de Lune. Dab C. I played it at my school recital. I was 9 years old. Martin was quiet for a moment. He let the name of the song sit in the air between them. I remember the recital, he said. Clara looked at him with gentle, honest eyes. You fell asleep, Dad. He didn't argue. He didn't explain, because there was no explanation that would cover 19 years. He had worked a double shift the night before that recital. He remembered sitting in that small auditorium with the squeaky wooden chairs and the smell of floor polish, and he remembered the warmth of the room closing in around him, and the soft music beginning, and then nothing. He had woken up to applause. He had clapped too quickly, so nobody would notice. He hadn't even known what he was clapping for. Clara had seen him from the stage. She had looked out at the audience the way all 9-year-old girls look out, searching for one specific face, and she had found him, head down, asleep in the 3rd row. She never said a word about it, not that night, not in the 19 years that followed. But Martin had known, the way fathers know the things they owe their children and carry quietly for years. He looked at her now. This woman sitting beside him who had grown up and built a whole life and forgiven him for things he had. Never once properly apologized for it. Something shifted deep in his chest that had absolutely nothing to do with the cancer. "Home it again," he said. "Please." She did, and this time Martin closed his eyes and listened. Really listened. The way he should have listened 19 years ago in a small school auditorium with squeaky chairs, when a little girl with his hands played her heart out on a stage and looked for his face and couldn't find it. That night the ward settled into its late quiet. Machines beeped their slow rhythms down the hall. A door opened somewhere and closed again. The light under the door turned from white to dim yellow, and Martin lay flat on his back and stared at the ceiling and did what he had been doing most nights for the past 3 weeks. He counted. Recitals he had missed. Parent-teacher evenings. He had arrived at late or not at all. The school play where Clara had the lead role, and he had sent a text that said, "So proud of you," without seeing a single second of it. The graduation dinner he had left early because of a call from work. The Sunday mornings he had spent sleeping off the exhaustion of the week instead of sitting at the kitchen table with his daughter while she ate cereal and talked about things that mattered to a 12-year-old girl. He wasn't a bad father. He had believed that for a long time. He had worked hard. He had kept a roof over her head and food on the table and made sure she had everything she needed. He had loved her. Quietly. Completely. In the way that men of his generation loved their children, which was mostly through sacrifice and showing up to work and never complaining. But lying here now, on a bed he would not be getting up from for much longer, with the ceiling offering no comfort and 7 days stretching out in front of him like a corridor with a wall at the end, Martin finally let himself understand something he had been avoiding for years. Providing is not the same as being present. Working hard for someone is not the same as being there for them. And a 9-year-old girl, sitting on a stage in a stiff dress, playing the most important song she knows, does not look out at the audience and think about the electricity bill. She looks for a face. One specific face. And when it isn't there, or when it's there, but asleep, something small and important breaks. Quietly. Without drama, the way the most important things always break. Martin didn't feel sorry for himself. There was no room for that now, and he had never been a man who leaned that way. What he felt was something quieter and sharper, not guilt, exactly. More like clarity, the kind that only comes when everything unnecessary has been stripped away and what's left is just the truth of a thing. He had one last chance, one last thing he could do. And he was not going to spend his remaining days lying in this bed rearranging regrets. At 7 in the morning, before the breakfast cart made its rounds, Martin pressed the call button beside his bed. The nurse who came in was Patricia, 50s, solid, 20 years in hospital work. The kind of woman who had genuinely seen everything and moved through her days without being rattled by much. She came in, expecting a request for water or an extra blanket. Martin said, "Is there a piano in this building?" Patricia stopped moving. "I'm sorry." "A piano. Any kind, upright, old, doesn't matter. Is there one anywhere in this hospital?" She looked at him for a moment with the expression of a woman recalibrating. Then she thought about it properly. "There's one in the chapel. 2nd floor. It doesn't get used much. Does it still work?" "I believe so." "Good," Martin said. "Can you let Dr. Harmon know? I'd like 2 hours outside my room each day." Patricia looked at his chart, looked at him, looked at the chart once more. She said she would pass it along, in the tone of a woman who had more questions but had decided they could wait. Dr. Harmon came in within the hour. This time he pulled up the chair and sat down, which Martin noticed and appreciated. He leaned forward with his hands loosely folded and gave Martin his full attention. "Patricia tells me you're requesting daily time outside your room. I want to understand what this is about before I make a decision." Martin met his eyes without hesitation. "I'm not asking for more time, doctor. I understand what I have. I'm asking for 2 hours a day to do one thing before it runs out." Dr. Harmon waited. "I want to learn a song," Martin said. "On the piano. For my daughter." The room held that sentence for a moment. Dr. Harmon looked at this 61-year-old man in a hospital gown with an IV in his arm and eyes that were completely, utterly serious. And he didn't say what any practical person might have said. He didn't list the reasons. It was unlikely. He didn't talk about energy conservation or realistic expectations. He stood up, clicked his pen, slid it into his pocket, and said, 2 hours a day. Don't overexert yourself, and you need someone present with you. Martin nodded once. I'll find someone. The chapel was small and still, and smelled like candle wax, an old hymn. The piano sat in the far corner, dark wood, slightly dusty. A few keys faintly yellowed at the edges like old photographs. It looked like something that had been placed there a long time ago, and had learned to be patient. Martin lowered himself onto the bench and sat in front of it. He didn't touch it right away. He just looked at it. 88 keys staring back at him. Black and white. Completely silent. Completely indifferent. Then he pressed one key with his right index finger. The note rose up and filled a small room. Round and low, and faded slowly. Martin sat with it. Then he pressed another. Another. Not a melody, just sounds, one after the other. Like a man walking into an unfamiliar room and touching the walls. To understand the shape of it, his fingers were thick and stiff. They had spent 34 years lifting crates and tightening bolts, not coaxing music from ivory keys. He pressed for keys at once by accident. The sound that came out was graceless and jarring. That's not a chord, said a voice from behind him. That's just a noise. Martin turned around on the bench. A young man stood just inside the doorway. 19, maybe 20. A hospital volunteer badge clipped to a jacket that was slightly too large for him. He had the look of someone who had walked in to leave something or check something and had absolutely not planned to stay. Do you play? Martin asked. The young man, the badge said. Leo gave the kind of shrug that young people give when they don't want to seem like they're showing off. Since I was 5. Martin looked at him steadily. Do you know a piece called Clair de Lune? Debussy? Debussy. Something moved across Leo's face. Recognition. And behind it, something that might have been concern. Yeah, he said carefully. I know it. Can you teach it to me? Leo opened his mouth. He looked at Martin, this old man in a hospital gown with arthritic hands and an ivy bruise on his left arm, sitting at an out-of-tune chapel piano with the stillness of someone who has already decided something and is simply waiting for the world to catch up. Sir, Clair de Lune isn't a beginner piece. It's one of the most technically demanding songs in classical piano. People spend years, sometimes their whole lives, working towards something like that. It's not something you can just... I have 6 days, Martin said. The chapel went completely quiet. Leo stood in the doorway for a long moment. He looked at the piano. He looked at Martin. He looked at the piano again, and something happened in that moment that Leo would not be able to fully explain to anyone later. Not to his mother, not to his friends, not even to himself. Something about the way this man sat, the straightness of his back, the complete absence of desperation or performance in his voice. He wasn't begging. He wasn't dramatizing. He had simply stated a fact and was now waiting, patiently, for whatever came next. Leo walked into the room. He pulled a chair from against the wall and set it beside the piano bench. He sat down. He reached past Martin and pressed one key, clear and clean, right in the middle of the keyboard. This is middle C, he said. Everything starts here. Martin had no training, no talent, no time. His fingers were stiff. His hands were tired. The clock was already moving. But for the first time in a very long time, he was not asleep in the 3rd row. He was exactly where he needed to be. Martin came back to the chapel the next morning at 8 o'clock. Leo was already there. He hadn't said he would be. They hadn't made any formal arrangement the evening before, but when Martin pushed open the heavy chapel door, Leo was sitting on a bench with his jacket still on, like he had arrived early and been waiting without wanting to make a thing of it. He looked up when Martin walked in. He didn't say good morning. He just moved over on the bench and made room. That small gesture meant more than Martin could say. They started with the left hand. Just the left hand. Leo had explained the night before that Clair de Lune was built in layers, that the left hand carried the foundation of the whole piece, the slow rolling pattern underneath, and that without it, nothing else would hold. So Martin placed his left hand on the keys, and Leo guided each finger one at a time. Press this one. Now this one. Move here. Hold that. Martin's fingers were slow and uncertain, moving with the careful hesitation of someone learning to walk again after a long time off their feet. He got it wrong repeatedly. He got it wrong in the same place repeatedly. Leo corrected him each time without frustration, without the strained patience of someone enduring something, just calm, steady. Try it again. By the end of that first session, Martin could play 8 notes. Just 8, but he could play them in order, at something close to the right pace, with the right weight behind them. It wasn't music yet. It was barely a beginning, but he played those 8 notes over and over until they stopped feeling foreign under his fingers, until his hands started to remember instead of think. He went back to his room that afternoon and lay on the bed and moved his fingers against the blanket, pressing the notes in sequence, silently, over and over. The nurses walked past. The breakfast cart rattled by. Martin lay there with his eyes open and played invisible keys on a cotton blanket and didn't care how it looked. He was learning. Day 2 was harder than day 1. Martin's hands had stiffened overnight. The medication, the cold, the years, and the fingers that had remembered 8 notes the evening before seemed to have forgotten half of them by morning. He sat down at the piano and reached for what he thought he knew and found only uncertainty waiting for him. Leo arrived 7 minutes late, slightly out of breath, apologized once, and then sat down and said nothing more about it. They went back to the beginning. Martin wanted to push forward. Leo told him the beginning was not finished yet. Martin pushed anyway. He stumbled badly on a transition between 2 passages and struck a cluster of wrong notes that echoed in the small chapel and died there, embarrassed. He sat back, put his hands in his lap, looked at the keys. Leo waited. He had already learned that Martin didn't need encouragement at these moments. He wasn't that kind of man. He just needed a second to absorb the difficulty of a thing and then decide to continue anyway. Martin put his hands back. They kept going. Day 3. Something changed. Not dramatically. Not in a way that felt like a breakthrough. More like a subtle shift in the angle of light. Martin's hands were still slow. He still made mistakes. But the piece was starting to take shape the way a sketch takes shape. Still rough. Still missing detail. The melody that Clara had hummed in his hospital room was beginning to appear, note by note, in his hands. Faintly. Imperfectly. But that was also the day the medication made his hands shake. It happened mid-session. Without warning, his right hand developed a tremor that skewed every note sideways, turning what should have been clean into something blurred and wrong. Martin stopped. Looked at his hand. The tremor continued. Small and indifferent, as if his body was reminding him of something he already knew. Leo said nothing for a moment. Then, quietly, he said they could stop for the day. Martin shook his head. He placed his right hand back on the keys. He let it shake. He played anyway, tremor and all, pushing through each passage at a slower pace to compensate, pressing each note with more deliberate weight. It wasn't the way the piece was supposed to sound. But every note was intentional. Every single one was a choice. They played for the full 2 hours that day. Day 4 was the day Martin almost broke. Clara came to visit in the afternoon, after his chapel session. She walked in, carrying a book she thought he might want, and a paper cup of tea from the canteen, and she sat down beside him, the way she always did, close, quiet, holding his hand without making a performance of it. She looked tired. The kind of tired that lives behind the eyes and doesn't go away with sleep. Martin looked at her face and felt the full weight of what he was doing and also the full weight of everything he had never done. And for just a moment the 2 things pressed against each other so hard inside his chest that he had to look away toward the window. He thought about telling her. He almost did. The words were right there, sitting in the back of his throat. I've been in the chapel. I've been learning your song. I'm trying to give you something before I go. But he didn't say it. Because the giving of a thing and the telling of a thing are not the same. He didn't want her to know ahead of time. He didn't want her to have to manage her emotions about it before it happened, to prepare a reaction, to come to the chapel already ready to cry. He wanted her to hear it first. Just hear it, the way she had heard it as a 9-year-old girl, fresh and unrehearsed, sitting in a small auditorium not knowing exactly what was about to move her. So he said nothing. He drank the tea she brought. He listened to her talk about small things, the traffic, a colleague at work, a book she had started, and he sat there holding her hand and storing up the sound of her voice, the way you store up warmth before a long winter. Day 5 was the day Leo didn't come. Martine arrived at the chapel at 8, as usual, and the room was empty except for the piano and the morning light coming flat through the high, narrow window. He waited 15 minutes. He checked the doorway twice. Then he sat down, placed his hands on the keys, and began. He had 2 days left. He played the opening passage. He got through the first third of the piece before he lost the thread and stopped. He went back to the beginning. He played the opening passage again. He got a little further this time. He lost it again. He went back. He did this 11 times. On the 12th attempt, he made it past the place where he always stumbled, crossed through to the other side of it, and kept going. His hands were shaking slightly. The notes weren't clean, but he was moving forward through the piece for the first time without someone beside him telling him where to go. On the 13th attempt, he played it all the way through. Not perfectly. Several notes were wrong. The timing buckled in places. But the shape of the whole thing was there, from the beginning to the end, in his hands. He sat with his hands still on the final keys for a moment, and looked at the far wall of the chapel and breathed. Leo arrived the next morning looking like he hadn't slept, with an apology ready in his mouth before he even got through the door. Martin waved it away before he could start. They had 1 day. That was all that mattered now. They ran the piece 3 times. The first run was careful and slow, Leo listening with his eyes closed, nodding at the parts that were there, staying quiet at the parts that weren't. The second run was faster, closer to the actual pace of the music, and Martin's hands moved with a confidence that hadn't existed 6 days ago. Not a pianist's confidence, not clean or polished or trained, but something more specific and more human than that. The confidence of a man who has decided that something matters and has given everything he has to it. The third run, Leo didn't coach at all. He just sat beside Martin and listened. When it ended, the chapel was very quiet. Leo looked at the piano keys for a moment. Then he looked at Martin. There was nothing useful to say. So he said nothing. That evening, Martin asked Patricia to pass a message to Clara. He told her he wanted Clara to come to the chapel with him after dinner. He told her he had something he wanted to show her. When Clara heard this, she assumed it was something small. A window he liked, a painting on the wall, some quiet corner of the building that had given him peace. She told the nurse she would be there. She had no idea what was waiting for her. They walked together down the corridor, Martin moving slowly, Clara matching his pace without remarking on it. The hospital was quieter in the evenings. Softer. The overhead lights had that particular quality they get after visiting hours. Less clinical, more human. Clara held his arm lightly, not steering, just connected. Martin didn't say much on the walk. He was saving something. The chapel was empty. One lamp was lit near the altar, throwing a low, warm light across the wooden floor. The piano sat in its corner, patient as always, exactly as Martin had left it that morning. Clara looked around the room with gentle curiosity. She looked at the candles. She looked at the stained glass. She looked at her father. Martin walked to the piano and sat down. Clara watched him. Something shifted in her expression. Confusion first, then curiosity. Then something she couldn't name yet. She watched him straighten on the bench and settle his hands in his lap and take one quiet breath. She watched his hands move to the keys. She watched him find his position, the particular placement that Leo had spent 6 days teaching him. The one that gave his stiff fingers the best chance of doing what he needed them to do. And then the first 3 notes of Clair de Lune came out of that old piano and rose up into the still air of the chapel. Clara's breath stopped. She recognized it immediately. Of course she did. It was the song that had lived in her hands since she was 6 years old. The one she had practiced so many hundreds of times that it had become part of her the way breathing is part of a person. She had hummed it in her father's hospital room 2 days ago without even thinking about it. And now here it was, coming from the piano, coming from her father's hands, rising in this small, quiet room like something that had been waiting a long time to exist. She didn't move. Martin played on. His fingers were not a pianist's. Fingers, they moved with effort, with visible concentration, with the slightly uneven rhythm of someone navigating a path they have only recently learned. Some notes arrived a fraction late. One chord in the middle carried a wrong note alongside the right ones. a small shadow of dissonance that passed quickly and was gone. But the piece moved. It braided. The melody Clara had loved since childhood was there, fully present, undeniable, shaped by hands that had never played anything before and would never play anything again. He didn't stop when he made mistakes. That was the thing she would remember most. He just kept going, the way he had always kept going, through the double shifts and the tired years and the things he didn't know how to say. The music wasn't perfect, but it was completely, entirely his. Clara's hand came up to her mouth. She was not watching his fingers on the keys. She was watching his face. And his face was not performing. It was not the face of a man trying to impress someone or trying to prove something. It was simply concentrated and open and wholly present. Perhaps than she had ever seen him in her life. He was not somewhere else. He was not half asleep in the third row. He was here. Entirely here. The last notes came. Martin played them slowly, deliberately, like he was making them last because he understood what came after them. The final chord settled into the room and then faded, and then the chapel was quiet again. He sat with his hands resting on the keys, not lifting them, just resting there in the stillness, like he didn't want to break the thing that had just been made. Clara didn't speak for a long time. The silence between them was not empty. It was full of a recital 19 years ago, and a man asleep in the third row, and a little girl who looked for a face and didn't find it, and never said a word about it, and loved her father anyway. Full of 34 years of double shifts, and good intentions, and the particular grief of a life where love was always present, but presence wasn't always. When Clara finally spoke, she didn't say what most people would have said. She didn't say it was beautiful. She didn't say she couldn't believe he had done it. She didn't reach for any of the words that the moment seemed to be asking for. She said, "Dad, you heard me." 3 words. Martin lifted his hands from the piano keys. He turned on the bench and looked at his daughter. Really looked at her, the way he had looked at that November sky from his hospital window, the way you look at something you were trying to keep. His eyes were wet. He didn't try to hide it. Nodded. Once. I heard you, he said. I'm sorry it took me so long. Clara crossed the room and put her arms around him, and they stayed like that for a long time, in the small warm light of the chapel, while the old piano stood silent beside them and the night outside the window went completely dark. Martin passed away the following afternoon. It was Geet. Clara was holding his hand. The machines were calm. The room was full of the particular stillness that comes when something has been completed rather than interrupted. The nurse on duty said he had seemed at peace through the morning. She said he had been moving his fingers slightly against the blanket when she checked on him, in the slow repeating pattern of a man playing a song only he could hear. Leo found out from Patricia later that evening. He walked to the chapel alone, sat down at the piano in the same spot where Martin had sat, and placed his hands on the keys. He played Clair de Lune from the beginning, the full version, the way Debussy had written it, every note in its place, every passage clean and complete. He played it slowly, and he played it all the way through without stopping. He played it for Martin. He played it for Clara. He played it for every person who ever loved someone without knowing how to say it, who ran out of time before they ran out of love, who left too many recitals too early and carried the weight of that quietly for years. He played it because some stories don't end with words. Some stories end with music. Martin Schulz had 7 days left to live, and he spent 6 of them learning a song he would only ever play once. He had no training, no talent, no reason to believe it was possible. He had only a daughter who had hummed a melody in a hospital room, and a father who finally, at the very end, stopped being too busy to listen. That is what this story is. Not a story about piano. Not a story about talent or performance or doing something impressive in the face of death. It is a story about a man who looked at everything he had left and chose to spend it being present. Fully, completely, irreversibly present. Some people leave money behind. Some leave letters. Some leave houses or names on buildings or long written explanations of how much they cared. Martin left 4 minutes of imperfect music in a small hospital chapel, and a daughter who finally, after 28 years, felt heard. That was enough. That was everything.